Hello, bored people, and welcome back to Muted History. Whether you're lying in bed scrolling at 2 a.m, sitting in traffic wondering why you're not a medieval peasant instead, or just procrastinating on literally anything else you should be doing right now, you've come to the right place. This is where we dig into the stories that make you realise your existential crisis is actually pretty recent in the grand scheme of things. Now, before we dive into today's story, if this kind of content helps you fall asleep, focus during work, or just escape the crushing weight of modern existence for a while, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people discover these longer form deep dives. And honestly, we could all use a little more perspective on how utterly weird it is that we're even here at all. Today's question is one that's been haunting archaeologists, anthropologists, and anyone who's ever wondered why humans are so spectacularly strange compared to every other animal on the planet. For nearly 250,000 years, our species walked around looking pretty much exactly like us. Same brain size, same hands, same faces you'd recognise if you saw them at a coffee shop. And yet for the vast majority of that time, they left behind almost nothing that screams complex culture. No cave paintings, no elaborate burials, no musical instruments, no art that survived the ages. Then around 50,000 years ago, something happened. Not gradually, not slowly, but relatively suddenly in evolutionary terms. Humans exploded into symbolic thought. Cave walls lit up with art, graves filled with meaningful objects. Music echoed through limestone corridors, and the archaeological record went from whisper quiet to absolutely blazing with evidence of minds that were doing something fundamentally different than before. So what changed? Was it a genetic mutation that flipped a switch in our brains? Did the climate finally stabilise enough for culture to take root? Or was it something else entirely? Something we're still trying to understand. This is the story of the entire 250,000-year journey of Homo Sapiens, and why that moment 50,000 years ago might be the most important turning point in the history of consciousness itself. Let's start at the very beginning, because the story of what happened 50,000 years ago actually begins much, much earlier. Picture this, it's roughly 300,000 years ago, and if you could somehow time travel to what is now Morocco, you'd find yourself in a landscape that looks nothing like the desert we know today. This was a green, lush savanna, teeming with wildlife, where early humans were crafting sophisticated stone tools and hunting large game with remarkable skill. In the year 1961, miners working in a limestone quarry near a small town called Jebel Irhoud accidentally uncovered something extraordinary. A skull that would eventually rewrite our understanding of human origins. For decades, nobody quite knew what to make of it. The dating was all wrong, the location seemed impossible, and the features were puzzling. But when modern techniques finally locked down the age in 2017, the result was stunning. This skull was over 300,000 years old, making it the oldest known remains of Homo sapiens ever discovered. But here's where it gets interesting, and a little unsettling. The face of this ancient human looks remarkably modern. If you reconstructed the soft tissue and put them in contemporary clothes, you might not give them a second glance walking down the street. The brow ridge is subtle, the cheekbones are tucked in, the jaw is delicate and human, but flip the skull around and something's different. The brain case is elongated, stretched out in a way that modern human skulls simply aren't. It's as if evolution delivered the human face first and took its time perfecting the shape of the mind that lived behind it. What makes this even more intriguing is what surrounded those bones. The Jebel Irhoud site wasn't just a single skeleton, it was a whole community frozen in time. Stone tools scattered around what appeared to be an ancient hunting camp, sophisticated spear points crafted with precision, scrapers and blades that required genuine skill to produce. These weren't crude implements. This was advanced technology for its time, demonstrating planning, foresight, and the kind of technical knowledge that gets passed down through generations, and yet something crucial is missing from this picture. Despite their modern faces and sophisticated tools, these early humans left behind virtually no evidence of symbolic thought. No art, no jewellery, no elaborate burials, no clear signs that they were creating meaning beyond the immediate necessities of survival. They were biologically us, but behaviourally something else entirely. This wasn't unique to Morocco. Across Africa, during this same period, we find similar patterns. In Ethiopia, skulls like those from Homo Sapiens show the same mixture of modern and ancient features. Some have the rounded brain cases we associate with modern humans. Others retain more archaic characteristics. It's as if our species was assembling itself piece by piece across the continent, with different populations experimenting with different combinations of traits. The genetic evidence backs this up in a profound way. Rather than emerging from a single population in one location, Homo sapiens appears to have evolved from a network of interconnected groups scattered across Africa. These populations were separated by vast distances, sometimes isolated for thousands of years, then reconnecting when climate conditions allowed. They shared genes, technologies, and probably ideas, creating a kind of continental laboratory where the modern human form gradually stabilised. But that stability came at a cost, and understanding that cost is crucial to understanding what happened much later. Because for nearly 200,000 years after these first modern humans appeared, the archaeological record remained stubbornly quiet. We find the bones, we find the tools, but we don't find the explosion of creativity and symbolic thought that would eventually define our species. The hardware was ready, but the software wasn't running yet. Consider what this means. For the vast majority of our existence as a species, humans who looked exactly like us were living lives that would seem almost alien to modern people. They had the same capacity for language, the same dexterous hands, the same curious minds. But they weren't painting on cave walls, or carving elaborate figurines, or burying their dead with meaningful objects. They were surviving, thriving even, but they weren't yet creating the rich symbolic worlds that we take for granted. This raises one of the most fundamental questions in human prehistory. What were they waiting for? If the biological capacity for complex culture existed for hundreds of thousands of years before it actually emerged, what finally triggered its appearance? Was it simply a matter of time, or were there specific conditions that had to be met before the human mind could fully unleash its creative potential? The clues are scattered across multiple continents and hundreds of thousands of years. In South Africa, sites like Blombos Cave have yielded some of the earliest evidence of symbolic behaviour. Pieces of ochre with deliberately engraved patterns. Tiny shells with holes drilled through them, possibly for stringing into jewellery. But these artefacts appear sporadically, flickering in and out of the archaeological record, like candles being lit and extinguished by an invisible wind. The same pattern appears elsewhere. In the Levant, early human sites show evidence of sophisticated hunting strategies and tool technologies, but symbolic artefacts remain rare and isolated. Even when they do appear, they don't seem to spread or persist. It's as if the capacity for symbolic thought was there, occasionally surfacing, but something was preventing it from taking root and flourishing. Part of the answer may lie in the sheer harshness of the world these early humans inhabited. The period between roughly 200,000 and 70,000 years ago was marked by extreme climate instability. Ice ages came and went. Massive droughts turned lush landscapes into deserts overnight, and sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of feet. Entire ecosystems would collapse and reform within the span of a few generations. For small, scattered populations of early humans, this kind of environmental chaos was devastating. Groups that had developed particular technologies or cultural practices would find themselves forced to migrate, split apart, or simply disappear when their local environment became uninhabitable. Knowledge that took generations to accumulate could be lost in a single catastrophic event. This creates what researchers call the demographic bottleneck problem. Complex culture requires not just individual intelligence, but stable populations large enough to maintain and transmit knowledge across generations. When populations are small and frequently disrupted, innovations tend to die out faster than they can spread. A brilliant individual might invent a new technique or create a beautiful object, but if they die before teaching others, or if their group is scattered by environmental disaster, that knowledge vanishes forever. The genetic evidence supports this harsh reality. During several periods in our species' early history, the total global population of Homo sapiens may have dropped below 10,000 individuals. That's smaller than many modern towns, spread across an entire planet. At those population levels, cultural complexity becomes incredibly fragile. Every drought, every disease outbreak, every conflict becomes an existential threat, not just to individual groups, but to the entire accumulated knowledge of the species. But something was building beneath the surface. Even during these difficult periods, humans were developing the cognitive and social foundations that would eventually support the explosion of symbolic culture. They were learning to cooperate in larger groups, developing more sophisticated forms of communication, and gradually expanding their capacity for abstract thought. The pieces were slowly falling into place, even if the final picture wasn't yet visible. And then, somewhere around 70 to 50,000 years ago, multiple factors began to align in ways that would change everything. The climate began to stabilize, providing the environmental foundation for larger, more stable populations. Crucial genetic variations that enhanced cognitive abilities reached fixation in human populations. Social networks expanded as groups came into more frequent contact with each other. And perhaps most importantly, population densities finally reached the critical thresholds needed to sustain complex cultural transmission. What happened next would reshape not just human behaviour, but the very nature of life on Earth. The long silence was about to break, and when it did, the consequences would be irreversible. The explosion that began 50,000 years ago didn't just create art and music and mythology, it created the foundation for everything that makes us recognisably human today. But to understand how profound that transformation really was, we need to understand exactly what the world looked like in those final moments before the fire caught. The world that existed between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago was not the world we know today. If you could somehow step through a time portal into that ancient landscape, you'd find yourself on a planet that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. The continents were in roughly the same positions. The sun rose in the east and set in the west, but almost everything else would leave you completely disoriented. Sea levels were over 100 meters lower than they are today. Entire continents that we think of as separate landmasses were connected by vast plains and grasslands. You could walk from France to England across what we now call the English Channel. Southeast Asia was one massive supercontinent, with Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines all part of a single, enormous landmass. Australia and New Guinea formed another giant continent called Sahel, separated from Asia by treacherous ocean straits that had never been bridged by land. The climate was locked in the grip of an ice age, but not the kind of frozen wasteland you might imagine from movies. Instead, it was a world of extremes and rapid changes. Massive ice sheets covered much of northern Europe and North America, but between these frozen zones were corridors of surprisingly rich grasslands and forests. The Sahara Desert, which today seems like an eternal barrier, periodically transformed into a green savanna filled with lakes, rivers, and abundant wildlife. For the scattered populations of Homo sapiens living through this period, the world was both generous and brutal. When conditions were good, when the rains came and the herds were plentiful, life could be remarkably rich. Archaeological sites from this era show evidence of sophisticated hunting strategies, elaborate tool technologies, and even the beginnings of long-distance trade networks. Groups were exchanging materials like obsidian and high-quality stone across distances of hundreds of kilometers, suggesting social connections that spanned vast territories. But when conditions turned bad, they turned catastrophically bad. The climate during this period was notoriously unstable, capable of shifting from lush abundance to harsh desert within the span of a few decades. Lake beds that had supported thriving communities for generations would dry up completely. River systems that had provided reliable water sources would change course or disappear altogether. Entire ecosystems would collapse, forcing human populations to either migrate rapidly or face extinction. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of constant movement and adaptation. Sites appear and disappear with startling frequency. A location that shows evidence of intensive human occupation for several thousand years will suddenly go silent, with no trace of human activity for tens of thousands of years. Then just as suddenly, new sites appear hundreds of kilometers away, suggesting populations that were constantly on the move, following resources and fleeing disasters. This nomadic lifestyle had profound implications for the development of human culture. When you're constantly moving, when your entire world can be packed up and carried on your back, there's a natural limit to the kinds of material culture you can develop. Heavy objects, elaborate constructions, anything that can't be easily transported gets left behind. This creates a bias in the archaeological record toward portable technologies and away from the kinds of monumental expressions that would later define human civilization. But it also created something else, incredibly sophisticated systems of mental culture. When you can't rely on permanent structures to store information, you have to store it in your mind. These early humans developed extraordinary capacities for memory, navigation, and oral tradition. They could carry detailed mental maps of vast territories, remembering the locations of water sources, seasonal gathering spots, and dangerous areas across landscapes larger than entire modern countries. They developed complex systems of knowledge about plant and animal behavior, understanding not just what was edible or useful, but when and where different resources would be available. This wasn't just practical knowledge, it was ecological science, passed down through generations of careful observation and experimentation. A hunter might know not just where to find a particular type of stone for toolmaking, but which quarries produce the best quality material at different times of year, and how to work that material to produce tools with specific properties. The social implications of this lifestyle were equally profound. Survival in such an unstable environment required unprecedented levels of cooperation and mutual dependence. Individual genius meant nothing if it couldn't be shared and preserved within the group. This created intense selective pressure for traits like communication skills, social intelligence, and the ability to work effectively in teams. Groups that could coordinate their activities, share information efficiently, and maintain social cohesion in the face of constant challenges had enormous advantages over those that couldn't. Over time, this led to the evolution of increasingly sophisticated forms of social organization, with complex systems of kinship, reciprocity, and collective decision-making. But perhaps most importantly, this period saw the gradual emergence of what researchers call behavioral modernity, the full suite of cognitive and social capabilities that would eventually enable the explosion of symbolic culture. The archaeological evidence suggests that by around 60,000 years ago, humans had developed most of the key components needed for complex culture. Advanced tool technologies, long-distance trade networks, sophisticated hunting strategies, and elaborate social organizations. What they didn't yet have was the population density and stability needed to sustain the kind of cumulative cultural evolution that would eventually produce art, music, and mythology. The pieces were all there, scattered across the landscape, like kindling waiting for a spark, but the conditions weren't quite right for the fire to catch and spread. The genetic evidence tells a similar story. Studies of modern human DNA suggest that around this time, populations that had been separated for tens of thousands of years were beginning to come back into contact with each other. Groups that had developed different adaptive strategies in different environments were meeting, mixing, and sharing both genes and knowledge. This genetic mixing may have been crucial for the later explosion of cultural innovation, combining different cognitive strengths and behavioural traditions into new hybrid forms. There's also evidence that during this period, humans were beginning to encounter and interact with other human species in unprecedented ways. The DNA of modern humans carries traces of interbreeding with Neanderthals, and probably with other archaic human populations as well. These encounters weren't just genetic exchanges, they were cultural exchanges too, opportunities to observe different ways of solving problems and adapting to challenging environments. But the most important development during this period may have been the gradual expansion of human populations into new and challenging environments. The journey to Australia, which required crossing at least 70 kilometres of open ocean, represents one of the most remarkable achievements in human prehistory. This wasn't just a matter of building boats, it required the ability to navigate by the stars, to plan for journeys of unknown duration, and to coordinate complex group activities over extended periods of time. The fact that humans successfully colonised Australia by at least 65,000 years ago proves that by this point they possessed all the cognitive and social capabilities needed for symbolic culture. They could think abstractly, plan for the future, communicate complex ideas and work together to achieve goals that no individual could accomplish alone. The hardware was fully operational. They were just waiting for the right software to run on it. As we approach the 50,000-year mark, all the necessary ingredients were finally coming together. Population densities were rising as humans learned to exploit new environments more efficiently. Social networks were expanding as different groups came into contact with each other. Genetic diversity was increasing as previously isolated populations began to interbreed. And perhaps most crucially, the climate was beginning to stabilise in ways that would allow for the development of more permanent settlements and the accumulation of cultural knowledge across generations. The stage was set for something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth: the emergence of a species capable of creating and transmitting complex symbolic culture. What happened next would transform not just human behaviour, but the very nature of evolution itself. For the first time in the planet's history, information would begin to evolve faster than genes, and the consequences of that transformation are still unfolding today. The explosion was coming, and when it arrived, it would change everything. But first, we need to understand exactly what that explosion looked like, and why it happened when it did rather than at any other point in our species' long and turbulent history. The moment finally arrives, but not with fanfare, not with a cosmic announcement or a divine intervention. Instead, it begins with the most human thing imaginable: someone picking up a piece of red earth and deciding it means something. Around 50,000 years ago, in caves scattered across continents that had never heard each other's names, human hands began doing something that no hands had ever done before. They started leaving messages, not for practical reasons, not for survival, but for the sheer, impossible audacity of believing that a mark on a wall could outlive the person who made it. Yup, the first hints appear in the archaeological record, like whispers in a crowded room. A piece of ochre with deliberate scratch marks found in Blombos Cave, South Africa. Shell beads with carefully drilled holes discovered in sites across North Africa. Carved bone fragments that serve no obvious utilitarian purpose. These aren't tools in any traditional sense. They're something entirely new. They're ideas made physical. But here's what makes this explosion so remarkable. It doesn't happen in one place and spread outward. It erupts simultaneously across vast distances, as if some invisible switch had been flipped in the collective human consciousness. In the limestone caves of what would become France, hands press against cold stone walls, and breath blows pigment around fingers, creating negative handprints that still haunt visitors today. On the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, similar hands create similar prints, separated by thousands of kilometres and possibly thousands of years, yet following the same inexplicable urge to say, "I was here." The cave paintings themselves are breathtaking in their sophistication. These aren't crude stick figures or simple outlines. In Chauvet Cave in France, lions prowl across chamber walls with anatomical precision that wouldn't look out of place in a modern wildlife documentary. Horses gallop in herds, their muscles defined by expert shading, their movement captured with an understanding of anatomy that speaks to generations of careful observation. These artists knew their subjects intimately, not just how animals looked, but how they moved, how they breathed, how they embodied the wild energy of a world that humans were only beginning to understand. But the visual arts were just one facet of this explosion. Deep in German caves, archaeologists have discovered bone flutes dating back over 40,000 years. Not simple whistles, but precisely crafted instruments with finger holes positioned to create specific musical scales. Someone was making music in the depths of the Ice Age, creating sounds that had never existed before, for reasons that went far beyond survival. They were making beauty for its own sake. The transformation extended to how humans treated their dead. Burial sites from this period reveal a profound shift in consciousness. The recognition that death was not just the end of biological function, but something that required ritual, meaning, ceremony. At Sungir in Russia, 2 children were buried with over 10,000 ivory beads sewn into their clothing. The amount of labour required to create these burial garments is staggering. Weeks or months of painstaking work to honour individuals who would never hunt, never gather, never contribute to the group's survival in any practical sense. This represents a cognitive revolution that's almost impossible to overstate. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, a species was creating meaning that existed independently of immediate survival needs. A bead necklace doesn't help you catch fish or escape predators. A cave painting doesn't provide shelter or nutrition. A musical instrument doesn't make hunting more efficient. These objects exist purely to carry information, identity, story, to transform the invisible world of human consciousness into something that could be seen, touched, shared, and remembered. The implications of this transformation ripple through every aspect of human behaviour. Language, which had probably existed in some form for hundreds of thousands of years, suddenly becomes capable of carrying much more complex cargo. It's no longer just about coordinating hunts or sharing practical information. It's about telling stories, creating myths, establishing laws and taboos that exist nowhere in the physical world, but everywhere in the human imagination. Social organisation becomes exponentially more complex. Groups that had previously been limited by the number of individuals who could maintain face-to-face relationships suddenly discover ways to create larger, more stable communities held together by shared symbols, stories, and rituals. The invisible bonds of culture become stronger than the physical bonds of kinship, allowing human societies to scale up in ways that no other species had ever achieved. But perhaps the most profound change is temporal. For the first time, humans begin to live not just in the immediate present, but in an expanded time frame that includes ancestors and descendants, mythical pasts and imagined futures. The cave paintings aren't just records of what animals look like. They're connections to a spiritual world where animals have souls, where hunting requires permission from supernatural forces, where the boundary between the physical and metaphysical becomes permeable. This expanded sense of time transforms everything. Decisions are no longer made based solely on immediate consequences, but on how they might affect future generations, or honour past ancestors. The present moment becomes part of a larger narrative that extends backward and forward through time, creating the foundation for everything we think of as distinctly human. Religion, philosophy, art, science, politics. The archaeological record shows this transformation happening with startling speed. Sites that show no evidence of symbolic behaviour suddenly bloom with artefacts that speak to rich inner lives and complex social meanings. The change isn't gradual, it's explosive, as if crossing some invisible threshold suddenly made all of this new behaviour not just possible, but inevitable. What's particularly fascinating is how universal this transformation appears to be. Despite being separated by vast distances and having no contact with each other, human populations across Africa, Europe, Asia, and Australia all begin exhibiting similar behaviours around the same time. They all start making art, music, jewellery, and elaborate burials. They all begin treating certain objects as sacred or meaningful rather than merely functional. This suggests that the capacity for symbolic thought wasn't something that had to be invented or discovered. It was something that was waiting inside the human mind, ready to emerge when conditions were right. Like a chemical reaction that requires specific temperature and pressure conditions to occur, the explosion of symbolic culture required the right combination of population density, social complexity, and environmental stability to ignite. The demographic factor seems particularly crucial. Complex culture requires not just intelligent individuals, but stable networks of individuals who can learn from each other, build on each other's innovations, and preserve knowledge across generations. When populations are too small or too scattered, brilliant innovations die with their inventors. But when populations reach a certain critical mass, knowledge begins to accumulate and compound, creating a runaway effect where each generation starts from a higher baseline than the one before. The genetic evidence supports this interpretation. Around 50,000 years ago, human populations that had been separated for tens of thousands of years began coming back into contact with each other. The mixing of these different lineages may have created hybrid vigour, not just genetically, but culturally, as different groups brought different knowledge systems and problem-solving approaches into contact with each other. Climate also played a crucial role. The period leading up to 50,000 years ago was marked by extreme instability, with rapid shifts between ice ages and warmer periods creating constant environmental stress. But around this time, conditions began to stabilise somewhat, providing the ecological foundation needed for larger, more permanent settlements and the development of cumulative cultural traditions. The neurological hardware was certainly ready. Brain size had reached modern levels hundreds of thousands of years earlier, and the basic anatomy needed for complex language and fine motor control was fully in place. What seems to have been missing was the social software, the networks and institutions needed to support the kind of complex cultural transmission that makes symbolic thought sustainable and cumulative. But once that software came online, the effects were irreversible. Humans had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. They had become a species that lived as much in worlds of meaning and symbol as in the physical world of survival and reproduction. The long apprenticeship was over. The real human story was just beginning, and that story would accelerate at a pace that would have been unimaginable to any previous generation. Within just a few thousand years of this initial explosion, humans would be sailing across vast oceans to colonize continents they couldn't even see from their starting points. They would be developing agricultural systems that would allow them to support populations orders of magnitude larger than anything that had existed before. They would be building the first permanent settlements that would eventually grow into cities, kingdoms, and civilizations. But all of that was still in the future. For now, in those first precious moments of symbolic consciousness, humans were simply learning what it meant to be human in this new and unprecedented way. They were discovering that they could create meaning, beauty, and connection that transcended the immediate demands of survival. They were realizing that the inner world of consciousness could be made visible and shared with others. The fire had been lit, and it would never go out again. But understanding why it took so long to ignite, and why it happened when it did rather than at any other point in our species' history, reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness, culture, and what it truly means to be human. The explosion at 50,000 years ago wasn't just the beginning of art and music and mythology. It was the moment when evolution itself began to operate by entirely new rules. The transformation that began 50,000 years ago didn't just change what humans made. It fundamentally altered how evolution itself worked. For nearly 4 billion years, life on Earth had been governed by a single set of rules. Genetic information was passed down through DNA. Mutations occurred slowly and randomly, and natural selection operated over thousands or millions of generations. But when humans began creating and transmitting culture, they accidentally invented a second evolutionary system that operated by completely different principles. Cultural evolution moves at light speed compared to genetic evolution. A useful idea can spread across an entire continent in a single generation. A new technology can be adopted, improved, and passed on within years rather than millennia. Stories, songs, and symbols can evolve and adapt in real time, responding to changing circumstances with a flexibility that genetic systems simply cannot match. This created something unprecedented in the history of life, a species that could adapt to new environments, not by waiting for favourable mutations, but by inventing new tools, strategies, and social systems on the fly. When humans encountered the frozen landscapes of Northern Europe, they didn't need to evolve thicker fur over thousands of generations. They invented tailored clothing and sophisticated shelter construction techniques within a few decades. The archaeological evidence from this period shows just how rapidly this new form of evolution could operate. Tool technologies that had remained essentially unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly began diversifying and improving at breakneck speed. The simple hand axes that had dominated human toolkits for over 1 million years were replaced by specialized implements designed for specific tasks. Bone needles for sewing, harpoons for fishing, spear throwers for hunting, scrapers for hide processing. But the real revolution was in how information itself was stored and transmitted. For the first time in Earth's history, crucial survival information was being preserved outside of biological organisms. Cave paintings served as libraries, preserving knowledge about animal behaviour and seasonal patterns. Carved objects functioned as memory aids, helping people remember complex stories and procedures. Ritual sites became universities, where knowledge was formally transmitted from elders to younger generations. This external storage of information had profound implications for human cognition. Individuals no longer needed to carry all necessary knowledge in their own minds. They could specialize in particular areas while relying on the group's collective memory for everything else. This allowed for unprecedented levels of expertise and innovation, as people could dedicate their entire lives to perfecting specific skills or understanding particular domains of knowledge. The social implications were equally revolutionary. Groups that had previously been limited by the cognitive capacity of their individual members could now function as superorganisms with collective intelligence that far exceeded what any individual could achieve alone. Decision-making processes became more sophisticated, incorporating not just immediate practical considerations, but complex cultural values, long-term consequences, and abstract principles of justice and morality. This transformation in social organisation enabled humans to coordinate activities on scales that would have been impossible for purely biological systems. Hunting expeditions could now involve dozens of participants following complex pre-planned strategies. Construction projects could span multiple generations, with knowledge and skills being passed down through cultural, rather than genetic inheritance, trade networks could extend across thousands of kilometers, connecting communities that had never had direct contact with each other. The environmental impact of these changes was immediate and dramatic. For the first time since the evolution of photosynthesis, a single species was beginning to reshape entire ecosystems through conscious, deliberate action. The megafauna that had dominated landscapes for millions of years began disappearing wherever humans appeared, not because of climate change or geological catastrophes, but because of coordinated hunting strategies that these animals had no evolutionary defences against. In Australia, giant marsupials that had survived every previous environmental challenge succumbed to human hunting within a few thousand years of human arrival. In Europe, woolly mammoths and cave bears that had weathered multiple ice ages vanished as human populations expanded and developed more efficient hunting technologies. The sixth mass extinction had begun, driven not by asteroids or volcanic eruptions, but by the emergence of cultural evolution. But humans weren't just destroying, they were also creating entirely new forms of life. The domestication of plants and animals, which would begin in earnest within just a few thousand years of the symbolic explosion, represented a completely novel evolutionary strategy. Instead of simply adapting to existing environments, humans began actively reshaping those environments to suit their needs, creating artificial ecosystems that supported far larger populations than natural systems ever could. The psychological implications of this transformation were perhaps the most profound of all. For the first time in the history of consciousness, minds were operating in multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously. Humans began living not just in the immediate present, but in an expanded time frame that included personal memories, cultural histories, and projected futures. They could imagine scenarios that had never occurred, plan for contingencies that might never arise, and make decisions based on abstract principles rather than immediate circumstances. This expansion of temporal consciousness fundamentally altered the human experience of reality. Death was no longer simply the end of biological function, it became a transition to a different form of existence in cultural memory. Individual identity became less important than group identity, as people began to see themselves as temporary vessels for eternal cultural traditions. The boundary between self and society became permeable, with individual consciousness merging into larger collective narratives. The emergence of symbolic thought also created entirely new categories of human experience that had never existed before. Beauty became something that could be pursued for its own sake, independent of any practical function. Truth became a value that could be sought through systematic investigation rather than simply inherited through tradition. Justice became a principle that could be applied universally rather than simply reflecting the interest of the powerful. These abstract concepts would eventually become the foundation for all human institutions: art, science, religion, law, philosophy, politics. But their origins can be traced directly back to that moment. 50,000 years ago, when humans first began creating symbols that carried meaning beyond their immediate physical properties. A bead wasn't just a piece of decorated shell, it was a marker of identity, status, belief, belonging. The neurological changes that accompanied this transformation are still visible in the modern human brain. Regions associated with symbolic processing, language comprehension, and social cognition show clear evidence of recent evolutionary development. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for abstract reasoning and long-term planning, is proportionally larger in humans than in any other species. The temporal lobes, which process auditory information and support language comprehension, show unique structural features that appear to be specifically adapted for symbolic communication. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this transformation is how it continues to accelerate. The cultural evolution that began 50,000 years ago has never slowed down. If anything, it has been speeding up exponentially. Technologies that once took centuries to develop and spread now emerge and become obsolete within decades. Social institutions that once persisted for millennia now undergo complete transformations within single lifetimes. The digital revolution represents the latest phase of this acceleration, creating new forms of symbolic communication and cultural transmission that operate at speeds that would have been inconceivable to earlier generations. Information that once took months to travel across continents now circles the globe in milliseconds. Cultural innovations that once required face-to-face transmission can now spread to millions of people simultaneously through digital networks. Yet the fundamental patterns remain the same. Humans are still creating symbols, still using those symbols to build shared realities, still transmitting cultural information across generations through non-genetic means. The cave paintings of Lascaux and the social media posts of today represent different expressions of the same underlying capacity, the ability to externalize consciousness and share it with others across space and time. This continuity reveals something profound about the nature of the transformation that occurred 50,000 years ago. It wasn't simply the invention of art or music or religion, it was the emergence of an entirely new form of life, one that exists as much in the realm of information and meaning as in the physical world of matter and energy. Humans became, in essence, a hybrid species, part biological organism, part cultural construction. Understanding this transformation helps explain some of the most puzzling aspects of modern human behaviour. Why do people sacrifice their lives for abstract ideals? Why do they create art that serves no practical purpose? Why do they spend enormous resources on rituals and ceremonies that have no material benefits? The answer lies in recognising that humans are not purely biological entities. They are cultural beings whose deepest needs and motivations are shaped by symbolic rather than physical realities. The explosion that began 50,000 years ago created the foundation for everything that we think of as distinctly human. Language, art, religion, science, technology, social institutions, moral systems. But it also created new forms of suffering and conflict that no other species experiences. Humans became capable of psychological torture, ideological warfare, existential anxiety, and the kind of abstract hatred that can persist across generations without any direct personal provocation. The same cognitive abilities that allow humans to create beauty and meaning also enable them to construct elaborate justifications for cruelty and destruction. The capacity for symbolic thought that makes possible the greatest achievements of human civilization also makes possible its greatest horrors. This is the paradox of symbolic consciousness. It is simultaneously the source of everything we value most about humanity and everything we fear most about ourselves. As we stand at the beginning of what may be another major transformation in human consciousness, the merger of biological and artificial intelligence, it's worth remembering that the last such transformation took hundreds of thousands of years to fully unfold. The explosion that began 50,000 years ago is still continuing, still accelerating, still reshaping what it means to be human in ways that we are only beginning to understand. The story of what happened 50,000 years ago is ultimately the story of how consciousness learned to reproduce itself, how mind became something that could exist independently of any individual brain, how information became a form of life in its own right. It's the story of how a species of clever apes accidentally invented culture, and in doing so, transformed not just themselves, but the entire future of life on Earth. And that transformation is far from over. The acceleration didn't stop there. In fact, what happened next makes the initial explosion look almost quaint in comparison. Because once humans figured out how to store information outside their brains, they accidentally created a feedback loop that would make the next 40,000 years look like someone hit the fast forward button on evolution itself. Here's where things get really wild. The humans who painted those first cave walls had no idea they were essentially inventing the first external hard drives. Every symbol scratched into ochre, every bead strung on sinew, every song passed down through generations was data storage. And unlike the biological storage systems that had governed life for billions of years, this new system had one crucial advantage. It could be copied, modified, and improved without waiting for genetic mutations. The archaeological record from this period reads like a technological arms race against time itself. Tool innovations that had previously taken tens of thousands of years to develop were now happening within centuries. The simple spear thrower, which multiplied human throwing power by several times, spread across continents faster than wildfire. Bow and arrow technology, when it finally emerged around 20,000 years ago, revolutionized hunting so completely that it's hard to find a culture that didn't adopt it within a few generations of contact. But the real game changer wasn't any single invention. It was the invention of invention itself. Humans had stumbled onto something that no other species had ever achieved: the ability to consciously, deliberately improve their tools and techniques through systematic experimentation. They weren't just using trial and error anymore. They were using trial, error, analysis, modification, and iteration. They had become, without realizing it, the first scientists. This shift is visible in the archaeological record in ways that are almost comical in their obviousness once you know what to look for. Pre-explosion stone tools show minimal variation over vast time periods. The same basic hand axe design persists for over 1 million years with barely any modification. But post-explosion tools show constant innovation, regional variation, and rapid improvement. It's as if someone had switched from making photocopies to running a research and development department. The social implications of this technological acceleration were profound. Groups that could innovate faster gained enormous advantages over those that couldn't. This created selective pressure, not just for individual intelligence, but for cultural institutions that could support and reward innovation. The first research laboratories were probably just designated areas where skilled tool makers could work without interruption. The first universities were likely just formalized apprenticeship systems where knowledge could be transmitted more efficiently. But here's where the story takes a darker turn, because the same cognitive abilities that enabled rapid technological innovation also enabled something else: warfare on an entirely new scale. The capacity for abstract thinking that allowed humans to create art and music also allowed them to plan complex military strategies, develop specialized weapons, and coordinate attacks involving hundreds of participants. The late Paleolithic period shows increasing evidence of organized violence between human groups. Fortified settlements begin appearing. Mass burial sites suggest conflicts that went far beyond simple resource competition. Weapons become more specialized and more deadly. The same creative intelligence that was producing the cave paintings of Lascaux was also figuring out the most efficient ways to kill other humans. This wasn't just random violence or competition for resources. This was ideological warfare, conflict driven by differences in cultural identity rather than simple survival needs. Groups weren't just fighting over territory or food. They were fighting over who had the right to exist, whose stories were true, whose gods were real. The capacity for symbolic thought had created new categories of human conflict that were far more vicious and persistent than anything based purely on material competition. The demographic evidence from this period tells a brutal story. Population growth, which had been slowly but steadily increasing since the symbolic explosion began, suddenly becomes much more volatile. Some regions show rapid expansion followed by equally rapid collapse. Others show evidence of complete population replacement, with new genetic lineages suddenly appearing, while older ones disappear entirely from the archaeological record. This pattern of boom and bust would become a defining feature of human civilization for for the next 40,000 years. The same cultural innovations that allowed human populations to grow beyond anything previously possible also made those populations vulnerable to new forms of catastrophic collapse. A drought that might have scattered a pre-symbolic population could now trigger the complete breakdown of complex social systems, leading to mass starvation, warfare, and cultural extinction. But the humans who survived these collapses weren't just the physically strongest or the most individually intelligent. They were the ones whose cultural systems were most resilient, whose knowledge storage and transmission systems could survive the loss of key individuals, whose social institutions could adapt rapidly to changing circumstances. Cultural evolution was becoming as important as biological evolution in determining who lived and who died. The genetic evidence supports this interpretation in fascinating ways. The period between 50,000 and 20,000 years ago shows unprecedented levels of population mixing and migration. Groups that had been separated for tens of thousands of years suddenly begin interbreeding. New genetic lineages appear in regions where they had never existed before. The human gene pool was being stirred and remixed at a rate that would have been impossible in pre-symbolic populations. This genetic mixing wasn't just random, it was being driven by cultural exchanges. Groups were coming together, not just to trade materials, but to share knowledge, technologies, and stories. Intermarriage became a way of cementing alliances and ensuring access to different cultural traditions. The most successful populations were often the most cosmopolitan, the ones that could incorporate useful innovations regardless of their source. The result was a kind of cultural arms race, with each group trying to develop better technologies, more effective social systems, and more powerful symbolic traditions than their neighbours. This competition drove innovation at an unprecedented pace, but it also created enormous instability. Any group that fell behind risked being conquered, absorbed, or simply outcompeted into extinction. The archaeological record from this period shows the emergence of increasingly sophisticated forms of social organisation. Burial sites reveal clear evidence of social stratification, with some individuals receiving far more elaborate treatment than others. Trade goods appear that could only have been produced by specialists working full-time at their crafts. Settlement patterns suggest the emergence of regional centres that coordinated activities across multiple communities. These developments point towards something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth: the emergence of institutions that could persist beyond the lifespan of any individual. Cultural traditions were becoming sufficiently complex and formalised that they could survive the death of their creators and continue evolving independently. The first immortal entities in the universe weren't gods or spirits, they were human institutions. The psychological impact of these changes on individual humans must have been profound. For the first time in the history of consciousness, people were living in worlds that were largely artificial, created by previous generations of humans rather than by natural processes. The landscapes they inhabited were shaped by cultural traditions. The tools they used were products of accumulated innovations. Even the languages they spoke were collective creations that no single mind could have invented. This created a new form of human experience that had never existed before: the sense of living inside history rather than simply experiencing an eternal present. People began to understand that their world was different from the world their grandparents had inhabited, and that their grandchildren would inhabit a world different from their own. The concept of progress, the idea that things could get better through human effort, was born, but so was the concept of decline. If human effort could improve the world, it could also make it worse. The same cultural traditions that preserved useful knowledge could also preserve harmful superstitions. The same institutions that coordinated beneficial activities could also perpetuate injustice and oppression. The capacity for cultural evolution was morally neutral. It could be used for good or evil with equal effectiveness. The late Paleolithic period shows evidence of both trends. Technological innovations made life easier and more secure for many people. Artistic achievements reached levels of sophistication that wouldn't be equaled for thousands of years. Social institutions emerged that could coordinate activities across vast territories and maintain peace between diverse groups. But the same period also shows evidence of environmental destruction on a scale that no previous species had ever achieved. The megafauna extinctions that occurred wherever humans spread weren't just the result of hunting. They were the result of systematic ecosystem disruption driven by cultural practices that prioritized short-term human benefits over long-term ecological stability. The humans of this period had become something unprecedented, a species capable of consciously reshaping the world according to their desires, but not yet wise enough to understand the full consequences of their actions. They had gained the power of gods without the wisdom of experience. The result was a pattern of boom and bust that would characterize human civilization for millennia to come. As we approach the end of the Paleolithic period and the beginning of what archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution, we can see all the pieces falling into place for the next great transformation in human history. Population densities were reaching levels that would soon make nomadic lifestyles unsustainable. Technological innovations were creating the tools needed for agriculture and permanent settlement. Social institutions were becoming complex enough to coordinate the activities of thousands of people. But perhaps most importantly, humans had developed the cognitive and cultural tools needed to imagine entirely new ways of living. They could envision permanent settlements, domesticated animals, cultivated plants, and complex hierarchical societies. They had the capacity to plan for futures that were radically different from anything that had existed before. The explosion that had begun 50,000 years ago was about to enter its next phase. The age of hunter-gatherers was coming to an end, and the age of civilization was about to begin. But the fundamental pattern established during that first great transformation would continue to govern human development. The constant acceleration of cultural evolution, the increasing complexity of social organization, and the growing power of human consciousness to reshape reality according to its own designs. The question that haunts this entire story is whether humans would ever develop the wisdom to match their power. The archaeological record from the late Paleolithic suggests that they were still learning, still experimenting, still making mistakes on a scale that no other species had ever attempted. The explosion of consciousness that had begun 50,000 years ago was far from over. If anything, it was just getting started. And as we stand at the beginning of what may be another major transformation in human consciousness, the merger of biological and artificial intelligence, the colonization of space, the potential transcendence of biological limitations entirely, it's worth remembering that every previous transformation has brought both unprecedented opportunities and unprecedented dangers. The explosion that began 50,000 years ago created everything we value about human civilization, but it also created every threat that now endangers our survival. The story of what really happened 50,000 years ago is ultimately the story of how consciousness learned to evolve faster than biology, how information became a form of life, and how a species of clever apes accidentally created a world that they are still learning how to inhabit. That world is our world, and that learning process is far from complete. The pattern that emerged from this explosion wasn't just about making better tools or creating prettier cave paintings. It was about something far more fundamental. Humans had accidentally invented the first technology that could improve itself. Every story told around a fire could be modified, enhanced, passed along with new details. Every technique for working stone could be refined through trial and error, then taught to others who might refine it further. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, information itself had become evolutionary. This created what researchers now call a ratchet effect. Knowledge could accumulate in one direction without sliding backward. When a hunter-gatherer band developed a better method for tracking animals, that knowledge didn't die with its inventor. It got passed down, built upon, combined with other innovations. The collective intelligence of human groups began growing in ways that individual intelligence never could. But here's where things get really interesting and a bit unsettling. This same period shows the first clear evidence of humans deliberately altering their own consciousness. Cave sites across Europe contain traces of psychoactive plants, not just scattered randomly, but concentrated in areas associated with art and ritual activity. We're looking at the earliest evidence of humans using mind-altering substances, not for medicine or nutrition, but to access different states of awareness. The implications are staggering. These weren't just people painting pictures of animals they'd seen during the day. They were potentially accessing altered states of consciousness and then translating those experiences into permanent visual form. The swirling geometric patterns that appear alongside realistic animal figures in many cave paintings might not be decorative elements. They might be the first recorded attempts to map the landscape of human consciousness itself. This suggests something profound about what was happening in the human mind during this period. The explosion of symbolic culture wasn't just about external expression, it was about internal exploration. Humans were becoming aware of their own awareness, conscious of their own consciousness. They were discovering that the mind itself was a territory that could be explored, mapped, and shared with others through symbols and stories. The social implications of this transformation were revolutionary. For the first time, human groups could maintain cohesion, not just through kinship or immediate mutual benefit, but through shared beliefs about invisible realities. They could cooperate based on common stories about gods, ancestors, and moral principles that existed nowhere in the physical world, but everywhere in the collective imagination. This created the foundation for something unprecedented: societies that could grow larger than the cognitive limits of individual human brains. Most primates can only maintain stable social relationships with about 150 individuals, a number that's now called Dunbar's number after the researcher who identified it. But humans with shared symbolic systems could cooperate in groups of thousands, bound together by common myths and rituals rather than personal familiarity. The archaeological evidence shows this scaling effect in action. Settlement sites from this period begin showing signs of social complexity that would have been impossible in smaller groups. Specialized craftspeople emerge, producing goods that require full-time dedication to master. Trade networks extend across hundreds of kilometers, connecting communities that never had direct contact. Burial practices become elaborate enough to require significant community investment, suggesting that individual deaths had become events of collective meaning. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the emergence of what we might call cultural inheritance. Just as biological traits are passed from parents to offspring through DNA, cultural traits began passing from one generation to the next through teaching, imitation, and storytelling. But unlike genetic inheritance, cultural inheritance could be modified, improved, and combined in real time. This created an entirely new form of evolutionary pressure. Groups with better cultural transmission systems, more effective ways of preserving and sharing knowledge, had enormous advantages over those that didn't. This led to the rapid evolution of teaching behaviours, memory techniques, and ritual practices designed specifically to ensure that crucial information survived from one generation to the next. The cognitive demands of this new form of life were intense. Individuals had to master not just the practical skills needed for survival, but also the complex symbolic systems that held their societies together. They needed to understand not just how to make tools, but what those tools meant in cultural context. They needed to know not just which plants were edible, but which ones were sacred, which ones were associated with particular stories or rituals. This created selective pressure for enhanced memory capabilities, more sophisticated language skills, and greater capacity for abstract reasoning. The human brain was literally being reshaped by the demands of cultural life. Regions associated with language processing, social cognition, and symbolic reasoning show clear signs of rapid evolutionary development during this period. But the transformation wasn't just neurological, it was also psychological. Humans were developing entirely new forms of identity that had never existed before. Individual identity became inseparable from group identity. Personal meaning became dependent on participation in larger cultural narratives. The boundary between self and society became permeable in ways that fundamentally altered the human experience of being alive. This shift is visible in the art of the period. The earliest cave paintings focus almost exclusively on animals, the external world that humans observed and interacted with. But gradually, human figures begin appearing, often in mysterious ritualistic contexts. Shamanic figures with animal features suggest people who could move between different worlds or embody different forms of consciousness. These aren't just pictures, they're maps of new forms of human identity that were emerging. The transformation also created new forms of human suffering that no other species experiences. Existential anxiety, the awareness of mortality, combined with the capacity to imagine alternative futures, became a defining feature of human consciousness. Ideological conflict emerged as groups developed incompatible beliefs about the nature of reality. Social alienation became possible as individuals could feel disconnected from the cultural systems that gave their lives meaning. But it also created new forms of human flourishing. Aesthetic experience, the capacity to find beauty and meaning in objects and experiences that serve no practical purpose, became central to human life. Spiritual transcendence, the feeling of connection to something larger than individual existence, provided new sources of comfort and motivation. Creative expression, the ability to bring entirely new forms of beauty and meaning into existence, became a fundamental human drive. The period between 40 and 20,000 years ago shows all of these trends accelerating. Artistic achievements reach levels of sophistication that wouldn't be surpassed for millennia. Musical instruments become more complex and varied. Burial practices become increasingly elaborate, suggesting rich mythologies about death and afterlife. Settlement patterns become more complex, indicating sophisticated forms of social organization. But the same period also shows increasing evidence of environmental impact. The megafauna extinctions that occurred wherever humans spread weren't just the result of hunting, they were the result of systematic ecosystem modification driven by cultural practices. Humans weren't just adapting to their environments anymore, they were actively reshaping those environments according to cultural preferences. This marks the beginning of a pattern that would define the rest of human history: the increasing power of culture to override biological and ecological constraints. Humans were becoming a force of nature in their own right, capable of reshaping the planet according to their collective imagination, rather than simply adapting to existing conditions. The implications of this transformation are still unfolding today. Every institution we take for granted, law, science, religion, art, politics, can trace its origins back to this period when humans first learned to create and inhabit shared symbolic realities. Every form of cooperation that extends beyond immediate kinship groups depends on the capacity for symbolic thought that emerged during this explosion. But so does every form of large-scale conflict. The ability to imagine abstract enemies, to fight for invisible principles, to maintain hatred across generations without personal provocation, all of these distinctly human capacities also emerge from the same cognitive revolution that gave us art, music, and mythology. As we approach the end of the Paleolithic period, we can see all the pieces falling into place for the next great transformation in human history. Population densities were reaching levels that would soon make nomadic lifestyles unsustainable in many regions. Technological innovations were creating the tools needed for agriculture and permanent settlement. Social institutions were becoming complex enough to coordinate the activities of thousands of people across multiple communities. Most importantly, humans had developed the cognitive and cultural infrastructure needed to imagine entirely new ways of living. They could envision permanent settlements, domesticated animals, cultivated plants, and complex hierarchical societies. They had the capacity to plan for futures that were radically different from anything that had existed before. The explosion that had begun 50,000 years ago was about to enter its next phase. The age of hunter-gatherers was coming to an end in many parts of the world, and the age of agricultural civilization was about to begin. But the fundamental patterns established during that first great transformation would continue to govern human development. The constant acceleration of cultural evolution, the increasing complexity of social organization, and the growing power of human consciousness to reshape reality according to its own designs. Looking back at this entire arc from our modern perspective, what's most striking is how recently it all happened. 50,000 years sounds like an eternity, but in geological terms, it's barely a blink. The entire history of complex human culture, everything from cave paintings to space exploration, has unfolded in less than 1% of the time that life has existed on Earth. And yet in that brief span, humans have fundamentally altered the trajectory of evolution itself. We've created forms of information storage and transmission that operate faster than genetic systems. We've developed technologies that can reshape entire planets. We've begun to transcend the biological limitations that governed all previous life forms. The explosion that began 50,000 years ago created the foundation for everything that makes us recognizably human today. But it also created the foundation for everything that now threatens our survival. Our capacity for large-scale warfare, our tendency to reshape environments without understanding the consequences, our ability to develop technologies faster than we can develop the wisdom to use them responsibly. The story of what really happened 50,000 years ago is ultimately the story of how a species of clever apes accidentally created a form of consciousness that could evolve faster than biology, store information outside of individual brains, and imagine realities that had never existed before. That consciousness is our consciousness, and we're still learning how to live with the consequences of its emergence. The questions that haunted those first symbolic humans, who are we? Why are we here? What does it all mean? Are the same questions we're still asking today. The difference is that we now have 50,000 years of accumulated culture to help us search for answers. Whether that's made us any wiser remains to be seen, but it has certainly made us more powerful, more creative, and more dangerous than any species that has ever existed. The explosion never really ended. It just changed platforms, accelerated its pace, and expanded its scope. From cave walls to clay tablets, to printing presses, to digital networks, the same basic pattern continues. Humans creating symbols, sharing them with others, building on previous innovations, and gradually constructing realities that exist nowhere in nature but everywhere in human consciousness. And that pattern shows no signs of slowing down. If anything, it's accelerating at an exponential rate that would have been incomprehensible to our Paleolithic ancestors. The next 50,000 years of human development may unfold in the span of mere centuries or decades, driven by artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and technologies we can barely imagine today. Whether we'll develop the wisdom to manage that acceleration remains the central question of our time. But one thing is certain: the explosion that began with a handful of humans painting animals on cave walls has become the defining force shaping the future of life on Earth. And we're all passengers on that wild ride, whether we understand it or not. The question that emerges from all of this isn't just about what happened 50,000 years ago, but about what's happening right now. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that most people don't want to face. We're still the same species that took 250,000 years to figure out how to make art. The same brains that struggled for 200,000 years to create a bead necklace are now trying to manage nuclear weapons, climate change, and artificial intelligence. Think about that for a second. Your brain, the actual physical hardware sitting inside your skull right now, is essentially identical to the brain of someone who lived 30,000 years ago and spent their evenings painting mammoths on cave walls by flickering firelight. The only difference is the cultural software that's been installed on top of that ancient operating system. This creates some truly bizarre contradictions in modern human behaviour. We can split atoms and sequence genomes, but we still get tribal warfare over which sports team is better. We can send messages around the world in milliseconds, but we still fall for the same kinds of social manipulation that worked on hunter-gatherer bands. We can model the climate of entire planets, but we still make most of our important decisions based on emotional impulses that evolved to help us survive in small groups on the African savanna. The archaeological evidence suggests that our Paleolithic ancestors weren't fundamentally different from us in terms of raw intelligence or emotional capacity. They were dealing with the same basic human drives: the need for belonging, the fear of death, the desire for status, the urge to create meaning out of chaos. They just had fewer tools to work with and smaller groups to manage. But that simplicity might have been an advantage in some ways. When your entire social world consists of 50 people you've known your whole life, social cooperation is relatively straightforward. When your technology consists of tools you can make with your own hands, the consequences of innovation are manageable. When your impact on the environment is limited by muscle power and walking speed, ecological destruction happens slowly enough for cultural adaptation to keep pace. The explosion of symbolic culture that began 50,000 years ago solved the immediate problems of prehistoric life, but it created entirely new categories of problems that we're still struggling with today. The same cognitive abilities that allow us to create beautiful art also allow us to create propaganda. The same capacity for abstract thinking that enables scientific discovery also enables ideological extremism. The same social bonding mechanisms that held hunter-gatherer bands together can now be hijacked by mass media and political movements. This is why understanding what happened 50,000 years ago isn't just an academic exercise. It's crucial for understanding why modern humans behave the way they do. We're not rational actors making optimal decisions based on complete information. We're Stone Age minds trying to navigate a post-industrial world using cognitive tools that evolved for completely different circumstances. The demographic patterns that drove the original explosion are still playing out today, just at a much faster pace and larger scale. Population density continues to accelerate cultural evolution, but now the relevant population isn't your local band of hunter-gatherers. It's the entire connected global population of 8 billion people. Ideas that once took generations to spread can now go viral in hours. Innovations that once required face-to-face transmission can now be downloaded instantly by anyone with internet access. But the same principles still apply. Cultural complexity requires networks, and networks require trust, and trust requires shared symbols and stories. The difference is that our modern networks are so vast and complex that most people can't even comprehend them, let alone actively participate in maintaining them. We're dependent on cultural systems that no individual fully understands, controlled by institutions that operate according to logics that evolved in completely different contexts. This creates a strange kind of alienation that our ancestors never experienced. They might not have understood the larger forces shaping their world, but they could at least see and touch most of the important elements of their daily lives. They knew where their food came from, who made their tools, and what stories held their community together. Modern humans are embedded in systems of staggering complexity that remain largely invisible and incomprehensible. The result is a kind of existential vertigo that shows up in everything from anxiety disorders to conspiracy theories to nostalgic fantasies about simpler times. People intuitively understand that something fundamental has changed about the human condition, but they can't quite put their finger on what it is or what to do about it. Part of the problem is that our cultural evolution has outpaced our psychological evolution by orders of magnitude. The basic emotional and cognitive architecture of the human mind hasn't changed significantly since the Paleolithic, but the cultural environment we're trying to navigate with that ancient hardware has become exponentially more complex and fast-changing. This mismatch shows up in all kinds of ways that we've normalized but are actually quite bizarre when you think about them. We live in artificial environments filled with geometric shapes and right angles that never occur in nature. We spend most of our time interacting with people we don't know personally through electronic intermediaries. We make our living by performing specialized tasks that would have been meaningless to our ancestors. We base major life decisions on abstract concepts like credit scores and career advancement that exist nowhere in the physical world. None of this is necessarily bad. It's enabled unprecedented levels of prosperity, security, and creative expression for billions of people. But it does create psychological tensions that our species has never had to deal with before. We're social animals trying to maintain meaningful relationships in societies too large for personal connection. We're storytelling creatures trying to find narrative coherence in systems too complex for individual comprehension. We're meaning-making beings trying to construct purpose in environments that often seem to prioritize efficiency over significance. The coping mechanisms we've developed for dealing with these tensions are themselves fascinating extensions of the same symbolic thinking that emerged 50,000 years ago. Modern religions, political ideologies, consumer brands, and entertainment franchises all serve essentially the same function as the cave paintings and ritual sites of the Paleolithic. They provide shared symbols and stories that help people feel connected to something larger than themselves. But there's a crucial difference in scale and speed. Paleolithic cultural systems evolved slowly over many generations, allowing time for testing, refinement, and adaptation. Modern cultural systems can emerge and spread globally within months or years, often without adequate testing of their long-term consequences. We're essentially running a massive real-time experiment in cultural evolution, with no control group and no clear understanding of what we're optimizing for. This acceleration has created unprecedented opportunities for both positive and negative cultural mutations. Beneficial innovations like scientific methods, human rights frameworks, and global communication networks can spread rapidly and improve life for billions of people. But harmful cultural viruses, misinformation, extremist ideologies, addictive technologies can spread just as quickly and cause enormous damage before effective countermeasures can be developed. The same pattern that drove the original symbolic explosion is still operating today, but at a pace that makes adaptation increasingly difficult. Cultural evolution is happening faster than institutional evolution, which is happening faster than psychological evolution, which is happening faster than biological evolution. The result is a series of mounting tensions between different levels of human organization that we're still learning how to manage. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for making sense of many contemporary challenges. Climate change isn't just a technical problem, it's a cultural evolution problem. Our economic and political systems evolved to optimize for short-term local benefits. But now, we need to coordinate global long-term responses to planetary-scale challenges. The same cognitive biases that helped our ancestors survive in small groups are now preventing us from addressing problems that require unprecedented levels of cooperation and long-term thinking. Similarly, many of the mental health challenges that have become epidemic in modern societies can be traced back to mismatches between our evolved psychology and our cultural environment. Depression, anxiety, addiction, and social isolation are all in part symptoms of minds that evolved for one kind of life, trying to function in completely different circumstances. But recognizing these patterns also points toward potential solutions. If we understand that many of our current problems stem from the mismatch between Stone Age minds and Space Age technologies, we can start designing cultural systems that work with human psychology rather than against it. We can create institutions that leverage our natural capacities for cooperation, storytelling, and meaning-making, while mitigating our tendencies toward tribalism, short-term thinking, and status competition. The key insight from studying the Paleolithic explosion is that cultural evolution is not random or inevitable. It's shaped by the specific conditions under which it occurs. The symbolic revolution happened when and how it did, because certain demographic, environmental, and social factors aligned in particular ways. Understanding those factors gives us some ability to influence the direction of ongoing cultural evolution. This is particularly important as we stand on the brink of what may be another major transition in human consciousness. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, brain-computer interfaces, and other emerging technologies are creating possibilities that would have been literally inconceivable to previous generations. We're potentially approaching another threshold moment where the rules governing human experience could change as fundamentally as they did 50,000 years ago. The question is whether we can navigate this transition more wisely than our ancestors navigated theirs. They stumbled into symbolic consciousness accidentally and spent the next 50 millennia dealing with the consequences. We have the advantage of historical perspective and scientific understanding that they lacked. We can see the patterns, understand the mechanisms, and potentially make more deliberate choices about what kind of future we want to create. But we also face challenges of scale and complexity that dwarf anything our ancestors encountered. The decisions we make in the next few decades could determine the trajectory of human consciousness for millennia to come. The stakes have never been higher, and the margin for error has never been smaller. The story of what happened 50,000 years ago teaches us that consciousness is not a fixed property of individuals, but an emergent property of networks. It can evolve, adapt, and transform in ways that are both wonderful and terrifying. Understanding that story is crucial for understanding who we are, where we came from, and where we might be going. Because the explosion that began with ochre on cave walls hasn't ended. It's just moving faster, reaching further, and carrying us all along for a ride that none of us fully comprehend, but all of us are helping to steer. The question isn't whether human consciousness will continue to evolve, but whether we can learn to guide that evolution in directions that serve our deepest needs and highest aspirations. The cave painters of Lascaux couldn't have imagined the world their symbolic innovations would eventually create. Similarly, we can't fully imagine what the world will look like after the next great transformation in human consciousness. But we can try to ensure that whatever emerges preserves the best of what makes us human, while transcending the limitations that have held us back. That's the real legacy of the 50,000-year explosion. Not just the art and music and stories it created, but the proof that human consciousness is capable of transforming itself in ways that seemed impossible before they happened. We are the inheritors of that transformative capacity, and the responsibility for what we do with it is entirely ours. The story continues, the acceleration continues, and the questions that first emerged around those ancient fires continue to echo through every choice we make about what kind of species we want to become. The explosion never ended, it just learned to think about itself, and that might be the most remarkable development of all. But perhaps the most unsettling realization is that we're still running on that same ancient operating system, just with exponentially more complex software loaded on top. Your brain processes social hierarchies the same way a Paleolithic hunter-gatherers did, through gossip, alliance building, and status competition. The difference is that instead of managing relationships with 50 people in your band, you're now supposed to navigate social media networks with thousands of connections, corporate hierarchies with hundreds of colleagues, and political systems with millions of participants. This creates what researchers call evolutionary mismatches, situations where our Stone Age psychology collides with Space Age reality in ways that produce genuinely bizarre outcomes. We evolved to pay attention to immediate physical threats, so we obsess over plane crashes and shark attacks, while ignoring statistically much more dangerous things like heart disease and climate change. We developed risk assessment systems optimized for small-scale, short-term decisions. But now, we're expected to evaluate global financial markets and long-term environmental consequences. The same pattern recognition abilities that helped our ancestors identify edible plants and track animal migrations now get hijacked by conspiracy theories and confirmation bias. The same tribal bonding mechanisms that helped hunter-gatherer bands coordinate hunts now get exploited by political movements and marketing campaigns. The same status competition that motivated individuals to become skilled toolmakers or storytellers now drives people to accumulate social media followers and consumer goods. But here's where it gets really interesting. The mismatch isn't just between our ancient brains and modern technology. It's also between different layers of cultural evolution that are advancing at different speeds. Our economic systems are evolving faster than our political systems, which are evolving faster than our educational systems, which are evolving faster than our moral systems. The result is a kind of cultural whiplash where different aspects of society are constantly out of sync with each other. Consider how this plays out in something as mundane as online shopping. The technology exists to deliver almost any product to your door within hours. The economic incentives exist to make that process as frictionless as possible, but the psychological and social consequences of that convenience, impulse buying, debt accumulation, environmental impact, social isolation, are still being processed by cultural systems that evolved for face-to-face market transactions in small communities. Or think about social media, which leverages our deepest evolutionary drives for connection and status in ways that can be simultaneously addictive and alienating. The platforms are designed to trigger the same reward pathways that motivated our ancestors to maintain social bonds crucial for survival. But the scale and speed of modern social networks create feedback loops that our psychological systems simply weren't designed to handle. The demographic patterns that originally drove the symbolic explosion are now operating at a global scale with technological amplification. Ideas don't just spread through local networks anymore. They can reach billions of people simultaneously through digital channels. But the quality control mechanisms that helped hunter-gatherer bands filter useful innovations from harmful ones have been completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume and velocity of information flow. This creates what information theorists call signal-to-noise ratio problems. In a small band, bad ideas could be quickly identified and corrected through direct feedback from people who knew you personally and had to live with the consequences of your decisions. In a global network, bad ideas can go viral and influence millions of people before anyone has time to properly evaluate their validity or consequences. The result is a kind of cultural chaos that would have been unimaginable to our ancestors. We are simultaneously exposed to more information than any human in history, while also being less equipped to process that information effectively. We have access to the accumulated knowledge of our entire species, but we often lack the context and wisdom needed to apply that knowledge appropriately. This creates a peculiar form of modern alienation. People intuitively sense that they're living through a period of unprecedented change, but they can't quite grasp the scale or implications of what's happening. They feel simultaneously connected to everyone and isolated from meaningful community. They have more choices than ever before, but often feel paralyzed by the complexity of those choices. The coping mechanisms people develop for dealing with this complexity often involve retreating into simpler, more manageable versions of reality, nostalgic movements that idealize supposed golden ages, fundamentalist ideologies that offer clear, unchanging answers to complex questions, consumer cultures that promise meaning through material acquisition, political tribalism that reduces complex issues to simple us versus them narratives. All of these responses make perfect sense from an evolutionary psychology perspective. They're attempts to recreate the kind of coherent, manageable social reality that our minds evolved to navigate. The problem is that the challenges we now face, climate change, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, require exactly the kind of complex, nuanced, long-term thinking that these simplifying strategies actively discourage. This is why understanding what happened 50,000 years ago isn't just historically interesting, it's practically urgent. We're living through what may be another major transition in human consciousness, comparable to the original symbolic explosion. But unlike our Paleolithic ancestors, who had tens of thousands of years to gradually adapt to the consequences of symbolic thinking, we're dealing with changes that unfold over decades or even years. The development of artificial intelligence alone represents a potential shift as significant as the emergence of language. For the first time since the symbolic explosion, we're creating forms of information processing that might eventually exceed human cognitive capabilities. The implications are staggering and largely unpredictable. We could be on the verge of solving humanity's greatest challenges, or we could be creating new forms of existential risk that dwarf anything our species has previously faced. Similarly, genetic engineering technologies are giving us the ability to directly modify our own biology in ways that could fundamentally alter human nature itself. We're approaching the point where cultural evolution might start driving biological evolution directly, rather than just influencing it indirectly through environmental pressures. The distinction between natural and artificial selection is becoming increasingly meaningless. Brain-computer interfaces promise to merge human consciousness with digital networks in ways that could transform the very nature of individual identity. The boundary between self and technology, which has been gradually eroding since the first human picked up a stone tool, might disappear entirely. We could be witnessing the emergence of genuinely collective forms of consciousness that transcend individual brains altogether. These possibilities are simultaneously thrilling and terrifying because they represent such a radical departure from everything that has defined human experience for the past 50,000 years. The symbolic explosion created the foundation for all human culture, but it still left individual consciousness basically intact. These new technologies could potentially dissolve the boundaries of an individual consciousness entirely. The question is whether we have the wisdom to navigate these transitions successfully. Our Paleolithic ancestors stumbled into symbolic consciousness without understanding what they were creating. They spent the next 50 millennia dealing with the consequences, both positive and negative, of that accidental revolution. We have the advantage of historical perspective and scientific understanding, but we also face challenges of scale and complexity that they never encountered. The patterns established during the original explosion suggest both reasons for optimism and reasons for concern. On the positive side, humans have repeatedly demonstrated remarkable adaptability when faced with unprecedented challenges. The same species that survived ice ages, volcanic winters, and massive environmental changes has also created art, science, philosophy, and forms of cooperation that span the globe. But the same period also shows our capacity for destruction, short-sightedness, and unintended consequences. The megafauna extinctions that followed human expansion weren't planned or intended. They were side effects of cultural practices that seemed beneficial in the short term, but had devastating long-term consequences. The same pattern of boom and bust that characterized Paleolithic societies has continued throughout human history, just at larger scales and faster speeds. The key insight from studying the original explosion is that cultural evolution is not inherently progressive or beneficial. It's simply a process that amplifies human capabilities, both positive and negative. The same cognitive abilities that enable scientific discovery also enable sophisticated forms of deception and manipulation. The same technologies that can solve global problems can also create new forms of global risk. This means that the future of human consciousness depends not just on our technological capabilities, but on our wisdom in applying those capabilities. We need to develop cultural institutions and decision-making processes that can operate effectively at the scale and speed of modern challenges, while still serving fundamental human needs for meaning, connection, and purpose. The archaeological record suggests that the most successful human societies throughout history have been those that manage to balance innovation with stability, individual creativity with collective coordination, short-term adaptation with long-term sustainability. These same balancing acts will be crucial for navigating the transitions ahead, but we also need to recognize that we're operating in uncharted territory. The next phase of human cultural evolution might be as different from the current phase as symbolic culture was from pre-symbolic existence. We might be approaching the limits of what individual human consciousness can comprehend or control. The systems we're creating might eventually operate according to logics that transcend human understanding entirely. This doesn't necessarily mean that human consciousness will become obsolete or irrelevant, but it does mean that the role of individual minds in shaping the future might be fundamentally different from what it has been throughout recorded history. We might be transitioning from being the primary agents of cultural evolution to being participants in forms of collective intelligence that we can influence but not fully direct. Understanding what happened 50,000 years ago gives us crucial perspective on this transition. It reminds us that consciousness is not a fixed property of individuals, but an emergent property of networks that can evolve, adapt, and transform in ways that are both wonderful and terrifying. It shows us that the most fundamental changes in human experience often happen gradually, through the accumulation of small innovations, rather than through sudden revolutionary breakthroughs. Most importantly, it demonstrates that human consciousness has always been a collective project. The symbolic explosion didn't happen because a single genius invented art or language. It happened because entire communities developed the social and technological infrastructure needed to support and transmit symbolic culture. Similarly, navigating the current transition will require unprecedented levels of cooperation, coordination, and collective wisdom. The story of what happened 50,000 years ago is ultimately a story about the power of networks, the importance of cultural transmission, and the unpredictable consequences of exponential change. Those same themes are playing out today at scales and speeds that would have been incomprehensible to our ancestors, but the fundamental dynamics remain remarkably similar. We are still the same species that took 250,000 years to figure out how to make a bead necklace. But we're also the descendants of the people who created that first explosion of meaning and beauty that transformed the world. The question is whether we can harness that same creative capacity to navigate the challenges ahead without losing what makes us fundamentally human in the process.
But
The explosion that began with ochre on cave walls has become a force that's reshaping reality itself. We're all passengers on that ride, but we're also collectively steering it, whether we realise it or not. The decisions we make in the next few decades about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, environmental protection, and global cooperation will determine what kind of consciousness emerges from this transition and what kind of world it inhabits. The cave painters of Lascaux couldn't have imagined the world their innovations would eventually create. Similarly, we can't fully predict what the world will look like after the next transformation in human consciousness. But we can try to ensure that whatever emerges preserves the best of what we've learned about cooperation, creativity, and meaning-making while transcending the limitations that have held us back. That's perhaps the most important lesson from the 50,000-year story. Human consciousness is not a destination, but a journey. It's not something we achieved once and can now take for granted. It's something we have to actively maintain, develop, and transform in response to changing circumstances. The explosion never ended because consciousness itself is an ongoing explosion, a continuous process of becoming rather than a fixed state of being. And that process is accelerating. The next 50,000 years of human development might unfold in the next 50 years, or 50 months, or even 50 days. We're living through history at light speed, with consequences that will echo through whatever comes after us. Whether that's cause for excitement or alarm depends largely on how well we can learn from the lessons of our own deep past while preparing for a future that might be unlike anything our species has ever experienced. The story continues, the acceleration continues, and the fundamental questions that first emerged around those ancient fires. Who are we? Why are we here? What does it all mean? Become more urgent and more complex with each passing day. But that's exactly what makes this moment so extraordinary. We're not just witnessing the next chapter of human consciousness unfold, we're actively writing it, one decision at a time. The acceleration that began 50,000 years ago hasn't just continued, it's become exponential in ways that would have been literally unthinkable to those first cave painters. But here's what's really unsettling. We might be approaching another threshold moment, another fundamental shift in what it means to be conscious, to be human, to exist as information processing entities in an increasingly complex universe. Think about it this way. Those Paleolithic humans spent roughly 200,000 years learning how to externalize memory through symbols. We've spent the last 50,000 years getting really, really good at it. But now we're on the verge of creating artificial systems that might be better at processing, storing, and manipulating information than biological brains ever could be. We're potentially approaching the point where the student surpasses the teacher. This isn't science fiction speculation. It's already happening in limited ways. Machine learning algorithms can now recognize patterns in data that human experts miss entirely. AI systems can generate art, write poetry, and compose music that many people find indistinguishable from human creativity. Large language models can engage in conversations that feel remarkably human-like, drawing on training data that encompasses more text than any individual human could read in multiple lifetimes. But what makes this particularly strange is that these systems are essentially doing what humans have been doing since the symbolic explosion. They're manipulating symbols, finding patterns, and generating new combinations of existing information. The difference is scale and speed. What took human culture millennia to develop, artificial systems can now accomplish in months or years. This creates some genuinely weird philosophical problems that our Paleolithic ancestors never had to worry about. If consciousness is fundamentally about processing information and creating meaning from symbols, what happens when we create systems that can do those things more efficiently than biological brains? Are we witnessing the emergence of new forms of consciousness, or just very sophisticated mimicry of consciousness? The uncomfortable truth is that we don't really know what consciousness is in the first place. We can describe its effects, the ability to experience sensations, form memories, make decisions, create meaning. But we can't explain how a collection of neurons generates subjective experience any more than we can explain how a collection of silicon chips might do the same thing. This uncertainty becomes particularly relevant when we consider the possibility of brain-computer interfaces that could directly connect human consciousness to digital networks. We're already seeing early versions of this technology being tested for medical applications. Devices that can help paralyzed individuals control computers with their thoughts, or cochlear implants that restore hearing by directly stimulating auditory neurons. But the long-term implications go far beyond medical applications. If we can create direct interfaces between brains and digital systems, we might be able to augment human memory, enhance cognitive processing, or even share experiences directly from one mind to another. The boundary between individual consciousness and collective information systems could become increasingly blurred. This raises profound questions about identity and continuity of self that make the philosophical puzzles of the Paleolithic look simple by comparison. If your memories are stored partially in biological neurons and partially in digital systems, where exactly does you begin and end? If you can access information directly from the internet through a brain interface, which thoughts are authentically yours and which are borrowed from the collective digital consciousness? These aren't just abstract philosophical questions, they're practical issues that we're going to have to grapple with in the coming decades. The same species that took hundreds of thousands of years to figure out how to make jewelry is now trying to decide whether to merge its consciousness with artificial intelligence systems. The pace of change has become so rapid that we're essentially flying blind into the future. But there are some patterns from the original symbolic explosion that might offer guidance. The archaeological evidence suggests that the most successful transitions happened when populations were large enough and connected enough to support gradual experimentation and adaptation. The groups that thrived were those that could balance innovation with stability, individual creativity with social cohesion. The challenge we face now is maintaining that balance at a global scale with technologies that change faster than social institutions can adapt. We need to develop new forms of collective decision-making that can operate at the speed and complexity of modern technological development, while still serving fundamental human needs for meaning, connection, and agency. This is where understanding our deep past becomes crucial for navigating our immediate future. The symbolic explosion succeeded because it built on existing human capacities. Our ability to cooperate, communicate, and create shared meaning. Any successful transition to post-human or transhuman consciousness will need to preserve and enhance those same capacities rather than replacing them entirely. The genetic evidence from the Paleolithic period shows that the most successful populations were often the most genetically diverse, the ones that incorporated beneficial mutations from multiple lineages. Similarly, the cultural systems that emerged from the symbolic explosion were those that could integrate innovations from different groups while maintaining overall coherence and functionality. This suggests that the future of human consciousness might depend on our ability to create hybrid systems that combine the best features of biological and artificial intelligence rather than simply replacing one with the other. Instead of uploading human consciousness into computers or creating artificial intelligences that operate independently, of human input, we might need to develop collaborative systems where human creativity and artificial processing power enhance each other synergistically. But this kind of collaboration requires unprecedented levels of coordination and trust between different groups, institutions, and even species of intelligence. We're talking about the need for cooperation protocols that span biological and artificial systems, regulatory frameworks that can adapt to rapidly changing technological capabilities, and ethical principles that can guide decision-making in scenarios that have never existed before. The scale of coordination required is orders of magnitude larger than anything our species has previously achieved. The symbolic explosion succeeded partly because it enabled cooperation between hundreds or thousands of individuals. The challenges we now face require cooperation between billions of humans plus potentially millions of artificial intelligence systems, all operating in real time across global networks. Yet the basic principles remain surprisingly similar to those that drove the original explosion. Success depends on our ability to create and maintain shared symbolic systems that enable coordination across diverse groups. It depends on developing institutions that can preserve and transmit knowledge while adapting to changing circumstances. And it depends on maintaining the delicate balance between individual agency and collective coherence that has always been the foundation of human social organisation. The difference is that we now have the accumulated wisdom of 50,000 years of cultural evolution to draw upon. We understand, at least partially, how symbolic systems work, how they spread, and how they can be designed to serve human flourishing rather than just maximising efficiency or power. We have historical examples of successful and unsuccessful cultural transitions that can inform our choices about the future. But we also face risks and opportunities that dwarf anything our ancestors encountered. The same technologies that could solve humanity's greatest challenges, climate change, disease, poverty, conflict, could also create new forms of existential risk that threaten the survival of consciousness itself. The margin for error is smaller than ever, and the consequences of getting it wrong are potentially catastrophic. This is why the story of what happened 50,000 years ago matters so much for understanding what's happening right now. It shows us that consciousness is not a fixed property of individuals, but an emergent property of networks that can evolve, adapt, and transform in response to changing conditions. It demonstrates that the most fundamental changes in human experience often happen gradually through the accumulation of small innovations rather than through sudden revolutionary breakthroughs. Most importantly, it reminds us that we are not passive observers of technological change, but active participants in shaping the future of consciousness itself. The decisions we make about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, brain-computer interfaces, and global cooperation will determine what kinds of minds emerge from this transition and what kinds of experiences they will be capable of having. The cave painters who started this whole process couldn't have imagined that their simple symbolic innovations would eventually lead to space exploration, quantum computers, and the possibility of artificial consciousness. Similarly, we can't fully predict where the current technological explosion will lead, but we can try to ensure that whatever emerges preserves and enhances the values and capacities that we most cherish about human consciousness. Creativity, empathy, wonder, the ability to find meaning and beauty in existence itself. The explosion that began with ochre on limestone walls has become a force that's reshaping the fundamental nature of information, consciousness, and reality. We're all participants in that process, whether we understand it or not. The question is whether we can learn to guide it wisely, drawing on the lessons of our deep past while preparing for a future that might be unlike anything our species has ever experienced. The story continues, the acceleration continues, and the stakes keep getting higher. But that's also what makes this moment so extraordinary. We're not just witnessing the next phase of human consciousness unfold, we're actively creating it, one choice at a time. And unlike our Paleolithic ancestors, we have at least some idea of what we're doing and why it matters. The fire that was first lit in those ancient caves has become a conflagration that's consuming and transforming everything in its path. Whether that leads to transcendence or catastrophe depends largely on how well we can remember who we are, where we came from, and what we want to become. The explosion never ended. It just learned to question itself, and that might be the most human thing of all. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about this entire story is how it reveals the fundamental continuity underlying all the apparent change. The same basic drives that motivated those first symbolic humans, the need for meaning, connection, creativity, and transcendence, are still driving human behaviour today. The same cognitive processes that enabled the creation of cave paintings are now enabling the creation of virtual realities, artificial intelligences, and potentially new forms of consciousness entirely. We are still, in essence, the same species that looked at red Earth and decided it could mean something beyond itself. We're still creating symbols, sharing them with others, building on previous innovations, and gradually constructing realities that exist nowhere in nature, but everywhere in consciousness. The platforms have changed, the scale has exploded, the speed has accelerated beyond recognition, but the fundamental pattern remains remarkably consistent. This continuity suggests that whatever comes next will still be recognizably human in some essential sense, even if it transcends the biological limitations that have defined human experience for millennia. The values and capacities that emerged from the symbolic explosion, our ability to cooperate, create, and find meaning in existence, are likely to persist and evolve regardless of the technological platforms that support them. That's perhaps the most hopeful insight from this entire story. Human consciousness isn't just a biological accident that happened to occur on one small planet. It's a pattern of information processing and meaning creation that might be capable of existing in many different forms, spreading to many different environments, and continuing to evolve in ways we can barely imagine. The explosion that began 50,000 years ago might just be the first phase of something much larger, the emergence of consciousness as a fundamental force in the universe, capable of understanding and shaping reality at scales from the quantum to the cosmic. If so, we're not just the descendants of cave painters, but the ancestors of something even more extraordinary. The fire burns on, the story continues, and the next chapter is ours to write. The question that haunts this entire narrative isn't just about what happened 50,000 years ago, but about what's still happening right now, in ways that most of us are completely oblivious to. Because here's the thing that nobody really talks about. We're not just the descendants of that symbolic explosion, we're living inside it. Right now, at this very moment, that same process of cultural acceleration that began with ochre handprints on cave walls is operating at speeds and scales that would have been literally incomprehensible to our ancestors. Think about what you did in the last hour. You probably interacted with information systems that didn't exist 5 years ago, using technologies that would have seemed like magic to someone from 50 years ago, while your brain, the actual meat computer sitting inside your skull, remained essentially unchanged from the hardware that was painting mammoths by firelight 30,000 years ago. This creates some genuinely bizarre contradictions that we've all just learned to accept as normal. You can video chat with someone on the other side of the planet, but you still get anxious about social interactions in ways that made perfect sense when your entire social world consisted of 50 people you'd known since birth. You can access more information in 10 minutes than any human in history could accumulate in a lifetime, but you still make most of your important decisions based on gut feelings and emotional impulses that evolved to help small groups survive on the African savannah. This isn't a bug in the system. It's the fundamental tension that defines modern human existence. We're Stone Age minds trying to navigate a post-industrial world using cultural software that's updating faster than our psychological operating system can process. The result is a kind of existential whiplash that shows up in everything from anxiety disorders to political polarization to the strange nostalgia people feel for simpler times they never actually experienced. But here's where it gets really interesting. The same demographic and technological patterns that drove the original explosion are still operating today, just at scales that boggle the mind. The population density that eventually enabled stable cultural transmission. We've gone from scattered bands of a few dozen people to interconnected networks of billions. The symbolic systems that allowed complex coordination. We've evolved from cave paintings to global communication networks that can spread an idea to every corner of the planet in hours. The tools that extended human memory beyond individual brains. We've gone from carved bones and painted walls to digital storage systems that can preserve and transmit more information than existed in the entire world just a century ago. Every smartphone contains more processing power than NASA used to put humans on the moon, and every person with internet access has potential contact with more human minds than any individual in history could have imagined. Yet we're still fundamentally the same species, running on the same basic psychological hardware, driven by the same core needs for meaning, connection, and purpose that motivated those first symbolic humans. This creates some truly surreal situations that we've all learned to navigate without really thinking about how weird they are. You can feel genuine emotional attachment to fictional characters you've never met, created by writers you'll never know, performed by actors who exist primarily as patterns of light on screens. You can feel tribal loyalty to sports teams, or political movements or consumer brands with the same intensity that your ancestors felt toward their actual blood relatives. You can experience profound loneliness while surrounded by more potential social connections than any human in history. These aren't signs that something has gone wrong with modern culture. They're signs that the same cognitive processes that enabled the symbolic explosion are still operating, just in environments they were never designed to handle. Your brain's pattern recognition systems, which evolved to identify edible plants and track animal migrations, are now trying to make sense of stock market fluctuations and social media algorithms. Your tribal bonding mechanisms, which evolved to maintain cohesion in small groups facing immediate physical threats, are now being triggered by abstract ideological differences between people you'll never meet. The social comparison instincts that helped your ancestors figure out their place in the band hierarchy are now trying to process curated highlight reels from thousands of acquaintances, creating forms of status anxiety that would have been literally impossible in prehistoric environments. The same drives that motivated individuals to become skilled toolmakers or storytellers now push people to accumulate followers, likes, and shares in digital environments that provide the neurochemical rewards of social recognition without the actual substance of meaningful relationships. But perhaps the most profound change is temporal. Those first symbolic humans lived in an expanded time frame that included ancestors and descendants, but their cultural transmission systems operated across generations. Ideas, innovations, and stories spread slowly, giving communities time to test, refine, and adapt them to local conditions. Now we're dealing with cultural evolution that operates in real time, where viral ideas can spread to millions of people before anyone has time to properly evaluate their validity or consequences. This creates what information theorists call signal-to-noise problems on a scale that's unprecedented in human history. In a small band, bad ideas could be quickly identified and corrected through direct feedback from people who had to live with the consequences. In a global network, bad ideas can achieve massive reach and influence before effective correction mechanisms can engage. We're simultaneously exposed to more information than any human has ever processed, while being less equipped to filter that information for accuracy, relevance, or wisdom. The result is a kind of cultural chaos that manifests in ways both obvious and subtle. Conspiracy theories spread faster than scientific research. Misinformation can outcompete accurate information because it's often more emotionally engaging or easier to understand. Political tribalism intensifies because people can find echo chambers that reinforce any belief system, no matter how disconnected from reality. Consumer culture promotes endless acquisition because it triggers reward pathways that evolve to motivate resource gathering in environments of genuine scarcity. Yet the same systems that create these problems also create unprecedented opportunities for human flourishing. The global networks that can spread misinformation can also spread life-saving medical knowledge. The technologies that can be used for surveillance and manipulation can also be used for education and creative expression. The same cognitive biases that make us vulnerable to propaganda also make us capable of art, music, and storytelling that can move people to tears or inspire them to extraordinary acts of courage and compassion. This is why understanding what happened 50,000 years ago isn't just historically interesting. It's practically urgent for navigating the world we're creating right now. We're living through what may be another threshold moment in human consciousness, comparable to the original symbolic explosion. But unlike our Paleolithic ancestors, who had tens of thousands of years to gradually adapt to the consequences of symbolic thinking, we're dealing with changes that unfold over years or even months. The development of artificial intelligence alone represents a potential shift as significant as the emergence of language itself. For the first time since humans learned to externalize memory through symbols, we're creating information processing systems that might eventually exceed human cognitive capabilities in most domains. The implications are staggering and largely unpredictable, touching everything from employment and education to the nature of creativity and consciousness itself. Similarly, biotechnology is giving us the ability to directly modify our own biology in ways that could fundamentally alter human nature. We're approaching the point where cultural evolution might start driving biological evolution directly, rather than just influencing it indirectly through environmental pressures. The distinction between natural and artificial selection is becoming increasingly meaningless when we can edit genes as easily as we edit text documents. Virtual and augmented reality technologies are creating artificial environments that can trigger the same psychological responses as physical reality, potentially transforming how we understand the relationship between mind and world. Social media platforms are reshaping human social behavior in real time, creating new forms of connection and isolation that we're still learning to navigate. Climate change is forcing us to confront the long-term consequences of short-term thinking on a planetary scale. All of these developments are happening simultaneously, interacting with each other in ways that no individual or institution fully comprehends. We're essentially running a massive real-time experiment in cultural evolution with no control group and no clear understanding of what we're optimizing for. The systems we're creating are becoming too complex for any single human mind to understand, yet they're shaping every aspect of human experience. This creates a strange form of alienation that our ancestors never experienced. They might not have understood the larger forces shaping their world, but they could at least see and touch most of the important elements of their daily lives. Modern humans are embedded in systems of staggering complexity that remain largely invisible and incomprehensible, dependent on technologies and institutions that operate according to logics that evolved in completely different contexts. The coping mechanisms people develop for dealing with this complexity often involve retreating into simpler, more manageable versions of reality. Exactly the same psychological strategies our ancestors used when facing overwhelming environmental challenges. nostalgic movements that idealize supposed golden ages, fundamentalist ideologies that offer clear, unchanging answers to complex questions, consumer cultures that promise meaning through material acquisition, political tribalism that reduces nuanced issues to simple us versus them narratives. All of these responses make perfect evolutionary sense. They're attempts to recreate the kind of coherent, manageable social reality that our minds evolved to navigate. The problem is that the challenges we now face require exactly the kind of complex, nuanced, long-term thinking that these simplifying strategies actively discourage. Climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, nuclear weapons. These are problems that can't be solved by retreating into tribal simplicities or nostalgic fantasies. But there's also reason for cautious optimism. The same species that survived ice ages, volcanic winters, and massive environmental changes has also created art, science, philosophy, and forms of cooperation that span the globe. The cognitive abilities that make us vulnerable to misinformation and tribal conflict also enable scientific discovery, artistic creation, and moral reasoning that can transcend immediate self-interest. The key insight from studying the original explosion is that cultural evolution is not inherently progressive or beneficial. It's simply a process that amplifies human capabilities, both positive and negative. The same symbolic thinking that enabled the creation of music and mathematics also enabled the creation of propaganda and weapons of mass destruction. The outcome depends not just on our technological capabilities, but on our wisdom in applying those capabilities to serve genuine human flourishing rather than just maximizing efficiency or power. This means that the future of human consciousness depends on our ability to develop cultural institutions and decision-making processes that can operate effectively at the scale and speed of modern challenges while still serving fundamental human needs for meaning, connection, and agency. We need governance systems that can make wise long-term decisions in the face of rapid technological change. We need economic systems that can distribute the benefits of automation and artificial intelligence fairly. We need educational systems that can prepare people for jobs and challenges that don't yet exist. Most importantly, we need to develop the kind of collective wisdom that can guide technological development in directions that enhance rather than replace the best qualities of human consciousness. This isn't about stopping technological progress. That's neither possible nor desirable. It's about ensuring that as our tools become more powerful, our wisdom grows proportionally. The archaeological record suggests that the most successful human societies throughout history have been those that managed to balance innovation with stability, individual creativity with collective coordination, short-term adaptation with long-term sustainability. These same balancing acts will be crucial for navigating the transitions ahead, but at scales and speeds that would have been inconceivable to previous generations. We're approaching what may be the final phase of the explosion that began 50,000 years ago, the point where human consciousness fully transcends its biological origins and becomes something genuinely post-human. Whether that transformation preserves what we value most about being human depends largely on the choices we make in the next few decades. The stakes have never been higher, the pace of change has never been faster, and the margin for error has never been smaller. But we also have advantages that no previous generation possessed. We have historical perspective on how consciousness evolves. We have scientific understanding of how cultural transmission works. We have global communication systems that can coordinate responses to planetary scale challenges. Most importantly, we have the accumulated wisdom of 50,000 years of cultural evolution to draw upon as we navigate this transition. The explosion that began with ochre handprints on cave walls has become a force that's reshaping the fundamental nature of reality itself. We're all participants in that process, whether we understand it or not. The question is whether we can learn to guide it wisely, drawing on the lessons of our deep past while preparing for a future that might transcend everything we currently understand about consciousness, intelligence, and what it means to be human. The fire that was first lit in those ancient caves is still burning, still spreading, still transforming everything it touches. The difference is that now we're conscious of the fire itself, aware of our role in feeding it, and potentially capable of directing where it goes next. That awareness might be the most important development in human history, the moment when evolution itself became conscious of its own process and began to guide its own direction. Whether we use that awareness wisely remains to be seen. But the very fact that we can ask these questions, that we can step back and examine our own cultural evolution in real time, suggests that we might finally be developing the kind of metacognitive abilities needed to navigate the challenges ahead. We're not just living through history anymore, we're consciously creating it, one decision at a time. The explosion continues, the acceleration continues, and the fundamental questions that first emerged around those ancient fires, who are we? Why are we here? What does it all mean? Become more urgent and more complex with each passing day. But that urgency might be exactly what we need to finally develop the wisdom to match our power. Because if we can figure out how to guide this process successfully, the future of consciousness itself might be unlimited. And that possibility, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, is perhaps the most fitting legacy of those first humans who looked at Red Earth and decided it could carry meaning beyond itself. They couldn't have imagined what their simple innovation would eventually become, but they lit a fire that's still burning brighter than ever. Now it's our turn to tend that flame and decide where it goes next. The story ends where it began, but the ending isn't really an ending at all. It's more like looking into a mirror that reflects infinitely backward and forward through time, showing us faces we recognise even when we can't quite place them. Those first humans who pressed their hands against cave walls 50,000 years ago weren't trying to start a revolution. They weren't attempting to launch civilization or create the foundation for everything that would follow. They were just trying to say something that mattered, to leave a mark that would outlast their own breathing. But in doing so, they accidentally discovered the most powerful force in the universe, the ability to turn thoughts into things, to make the invisible visible, to create meaning that could survive the death of the minds that created it. And here we are, 50,000 years later, still doing exactly the same thing, still pressing our hands against walls, digital walls now, but walls nonetheless, still trying to say something that matters, to leave marks that will outlast our breathing. The platforms have changed, the scale has exploded beyond recognition, but the fundamental drive remains identical. We are still the same species that looked at Red Earth and decided it could mean something beyond itself. This continuity is both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it suggests that no matter how much technology changes, no matter how far we travel into space, or how deeply we merge with artificial intelligence, something essentially human will persist. The need to create, to connect, to find meaning in existence. These drives seem to be hardwired into the very structure of consciousness itself. But it's also unsettling because it reveals how little we've actually changed, despite all our apparent progress. We're still tribal creatures, forming in-groups and out-groups based on arbitrary markers. We're still status-seeking animals competing for resources and recognition. We're still meaning-making beings desperately trying to construct coherent narratives out of the chaos of existence. The software has been updated millions of times, but the hardware remains stubbornly Stone Age. Perhaps that's the real lesson of this entire story. The explosion that began 50,000 years ago wasn't a one-time event that happened and then ended. It was the beginning of an ongoing process that's still accelerating, still transforming everything it touches, still reshaping what it means to be conscious in an increasingly complex universe. We're not the descendants of that explosion. We are that explosion, still expanding, still creating new forms of meaning and connection at speeds that would have been incomprehensible to our ancestors. The handprints on the cave walls were never really about the hands that made them. They were about the minds behind the hands, the consciousness that could step outside itself long enough to say, I was here, I existed, I mattered. And every status update, every photograph, every piece of art or music or writing we create today is essentially the same gesture. The same desperate and beautiful attempt to prove that our brief flicker of awareness in the cosmic darkness meant something. The fire that was lit in those ancient caves is still burning. It's burning in every classroom where knowledge is transmitted, every laboratory where new discoveries are made, every studio where art is created, every conversation where ideas are shared. It's burning in the servers that store our collective memory, in the satellites that connect us across impossible distances, in the code that's teaching machines to think and dream and maybe even to wonder what it all means. Whether that fire leads to transcendence or catastrophe remains to be seen. But one thing is certain, it's not going out. The explosion that began with ochre and cave walls has become a self-sustaining reaction that's transforming not just human consciousness, but the very nature of information and meaning in the universe. We've gone from creating simple symbols to creating entire virtual realities, from telling stories around fires to building global networks that can transmit any story to anyone, anywhere, instantly. And yet, at the deepest level, we're still doing exactly what those first symbolic humans were doing, trying to make sense of existence, trying to connect with something larger than ourselves, trying to create beauty and meaning in a universe that doesn't seem to care whether we exist or not. The tools have changed, the scale has expanded beyond imagination, but the fundamental human project remains the same. So when you see those handprints in the caves, don't think of them as primitive artifacts from a simpler time. Think of them as the first entries in a conversation that's still ongoing, the opening lines of a story that we're all still writing together. Every time you create something, share something, or find meaning in something, you're continuing that same conversation, adding your voice to a chorus that began 50,000 years ago and shows no signs of stopping. The explosion never ended because consciousness itself is an explosion, an ongoing eruption of awareness, creativity, and meaning that's still expanding, still accelerating, still transforming everything it encounters. We are the universe becoming aware of itself, and that awareness is spreading at the speed of light across galaxies, carrying with it the same basic message that those first cave painters were trying to communicate. We were here, we existed, we mattered, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Maybe the whole point of consciousness, the entire reason the universe bothered to evolve minds capable of wondering about their own existence, was simply to ensure that someone, somewhere, would be around to notice how beautiful and strange and meaningful it all is. If so, then those first humans who decided that Red Earth could carry meaning beyond itself didn't just start a revolution, they fulfilled the deepest purpose of existence itself. The story continues, the fire burns on, and the conversation that began with handprints on cave walls echoes still in every word we speak, every image we create, every moment we pause to wonder at the sheer improbability of being conscious in a universe that mostly isn't. We are the children of that first explosion of meaning, and we carry its light forward into whatever comes next. The explosion never ended. It just learned to question itself, and that might be the most human thing of all. Thanks for sticking around through this journey into deep time, bored people. If this helped you procrastinate on whatever you're supposed to be doing, or if it just gave you something to think about while lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates the weird fact that we're all conscious meat computers trying to figure out why we exist. And let me know in the comments, Do you see yourself in those cave painters? Do you feel the continuity stretching back 50,000 years? Or does it all feel impossibly distant? Either way, you're part of the story now. The explosion continues and we're all along for the ride. I'll see you in the next one.